Hello, welcome to the channel. My name is Matthew Mele Gray, and I'm very pleased that you can join me. So what I thought we could talk about today in the broadcast is the matter of JW and blood. Because Jehovah's Witnesses have, by reputation and by doctrine and by preaching and by teaching, a policy that has put it under the spotlight when it comes to medical crisis and ethics. And so historically, it's been known that Jehovah's Witnesses make a stand on the matter of blood. So I thought we could get into that today. And first of all, we think of the prohibition on blood. So if we think of Acts, and the chapter is, let me get my glasses on here, 15, verses 28 and 29, that is a scripture that is often quoted that shows that from a Jehovah's Witness point of view, blood is sacred and it should not even be touched. In fact, I'm going to read it from the New World Translation, 2013 edition. The Revised Bible says at Acts 15, verses 28 and 29, chapter 15, verses 28 and 29, it says, "For the Holy Spirit and we ourselves have favored, adding no further burden to you except these necessary things, to keep abstaining from things sacrificed to idols, from blood, from what is strangled, and from sexual immorality. If you carefully keep yourselves from these things, you will prosper. Good health to you." So there's the scripture for which forms the stand on blood. So Matt, what's the issue? Why bring this up? Well, recently, an acquaintance of mine had a medical emergency. And so it was discussed that, when I say discussed, it was put into the gossip culture. In the gossip culture, that this person had decided to take blood. So you could probably say, well, why is it even in the gossip culture? Isn't that a personal thing? Well, when it's controversial, sometimes persons make a stand. It might be a show of liberation, for instance, from a prohibition in a high control religious society that has the means to effect disciplinary action and what has been termed or thought to be coercive policies. In other words, when they say that these matters are matters of conscience or individual conscience, actually it's very heavily regulated. So this is a tricky area, and I was thinking that this may be an opportunity, since it's happened now, to ask a few questions. Questions that normally wouldn't have been considered in a very high control situation. So I wanted to have an explanation from the Jehovah's Witness point of view, the blood doctrine. Because enter into the scene this thing called blood fractions. And we now have a very tricky situation It is so tricky that you could say that if it is unresolved, that 98% of all branches around the world are essentially affected by the strict application of this doctrine. That is, if it is representing Jehovah's view, Jehovah as the Almighty Sovereign, the Creator, from a Jehovah's Witness point of view, his view on the sanctity of life and blood. And blood is a big thing, because that is the basis for forgiveness of sins. It is Jesus Christ's sin-atoning value. That is the proper use of blood in the JW doctrine and religious framework. So, when it comes to blood fractions or components, these are two different things. So, blood, is that acceptable? Components, is that acceptable? Blood fractions, is that acceptable? Just exactly what is a matter of conscience? What is something that would not have tribunal or disciplinary action or God's wrath for a violation? Because we happen to use our conscience and say, well, I'm going to take this, or I'm going to take that, or I'm going to refuse this, or I'm going to refuse that. So, as a JW, according to that scripture in Acts 15, we know, according to what is written, that whole blood by doctrine is wrong to eat, and by extension, to put into the veins, due to the Act's prohibition, saying you must abstain. So again, this is a tricky situation, so I employ my academic proviso or disclaimer. I say, please approach this thesis with antithesis for synthesis and with a healthy skepticism for essential critical thinking and academic review. Because it is a situation which is able to highlight some of the difficulties and some of the challenges and some of the psychology that for many persons they might find absolutely fascinating, or they may be disgusted or appalled by it, or you may have an earnest JW who's endeavoring to try and make sense of it in order to grow spiritually, or in order to know what kind of decisions they need to make in order to harmonize themselves with Jehovah, according to the biblical framework and doctrine laid out in the JW community. So again, we want to try and be clear with this. We want to try and be neutral. I wonder if that's possible. But my goal has always been to go according to the Jehovah's Witness internal doctrinal point of view. I want to use the logic and terminology that is found within that system, rather than just critique. And again, I say, is that possible not to critique? I'm trying to find the all-encompassing way, I suppose. So I'm trying to frame the core premise correctly with that scripture in Acts chapter 15. And let's see if we can build cleanly from there. So what's the foundational basis? What's the Jehovah's Witness viewpoint? What's the psychology? Well, Jehovah's Witnesses understand several scriptures, not just the book of Acts. So that forms the single continuous divine prohibition on blood. So we have scriptures like Genesis chapter 9 verses 4. that says, flesh with its soul, its blood, you must not eat. You have Leviticus chapter 17, verses 10 to 14, which shows that blood represents life and belongs to God. And then, of course, we re-emphasize the book of Acts, chapter 15, verses 28 to 29, where Christians must abstain from blood. So we've already established now that from the JW perspective, blood itself symbolizes life itself. And life belongs to Jehovah, the Creator, the Almighty Sovereign. Jehovah being the name, the modern name, or the contemporary name that is given to the Creator. So, blood must not be used, then, to sustain life in any way other than remaining where it came from, and that is within the body. And so that is why the equating among Jehovah's Witnesses of eating blood and receiving blood intravenously is both seen as using blood to sustain life. And so here's where the absolute prohibition, it's not a conscience matter. This is where the prohibition comes in. So according to Jehovah's Witness doctrine, the following are strictly forbidden for baptized Jehovah's Witnesses. Whole blood. Got that? So that would include stored whole blood, fresh whole blood, autologous blood if stored and later reinfused. All right. Then we move on to 4 primary blood components. So these are viewed as representing blood as a whole and therefore are prohibited. So what are they? 1, red blood cells. 2, white blood cells. 3, platelets. And 4, plasma. Okay, so let me repeat that because I was tongue-tied. Red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. Okay. So accepting any of the 4 main components there is considered a violation of the command to abstain from blood. And so this would result in a judicial action. They say elders committee or tribunal, which could mean removal of privileges, social shunning, formerly known as disfellowshipping, or removal. So there's sanctions. And that removal, we have discussed in other videos how hectic that can be. It's not just a mere removal. It can have dire consequences. So blood fractions. Let's talk about that. So this is where conscience is introduced. And this is where the doctrine becomes far more nuanced in its approach. And so Jehovah's Witnesses teach that once blood is broken down beyond its primary components, remember, some derivatives may be considered fractions rather than blood itself. Oh, really? Yeah. Why is this interesting? Because this is where it is permissible. There's a pathway to be accepted, or a pathway that is permissible, and it is framed as personal conscience. So, the Watchtower states that fractions derived from blood components may be accepted if the individual witness decides so. Now, before we go on, I want to talk about a situation, okay, in the insight on the news, right? So the insight on the news is the Watchtower publication, and I'm reading it off here, from 1977, 7/1, and it is under the heading, Donated Blood as Sacrifice. Now, to part quote it, it says, to some it may appear humanitarian for persons to donate blood that will be used for transfusion purposes. Obviously, at least some individuals believe that there is religious merit and spiritual benefit in doing this. However, when viewed from a biblical standpoint, such a sacrifice is of no benefit to the donor and actually violates the law of God. The article goes on to say, besides talking about the blood of Jesus that cleanses us of all sin, it makes this point. It says, God's law, part quote, God's law to his people of ancient times specified that blood, when taken from a body, was not to be used for anything, but was to be disposed of. Quotes Deuteronomy 12, verses 16. Later, Christians were specifically required to abstain from blood, and it quotes Acts 15, 28 and 29. So it says, so donating blood as sacrifice is neither effective nor approved by God. So you might be thinking, well, Matt, why are you harping about this? Because how would a Jehovah's Witness receive a fraction, a blood fraction? Now, these are what are termed permissible by personal conscience. Let's go into it, shall we? From plasma, you get albumin, immunoglobulins, which you could say are antibodies, clotting factors, so you've got factor 5, 6, 7, factor 8, and factor 9. Those are the clotting factors. Then you've got something called cryoprecipitate fractions. And then from red cells, you've got hemoglobin fractions, so that's in limited context, sure. But these are described as not blood. It's too small to be considered life-bearing and comparable to nutrients extracted from forbidden foods. I want to ask, how are these derived? If a Jehovah's Witness cannot donate that blood to get these fractions, they have to rely on another source. But at the same time, a witness must not be, when I say a witness, a Jehovah's Witness must not be judged for accepting or refusing fractions. Elders are therefore instructed not to enforce uniformity on conscience decisions. So, interesting situation. So, procedures are often treated as conscience matters. So, some medical techniques involve blood leaving the body briefly and returning without being stored. So, can you think of some? Cell salvage is one, or cell saver. So that's a conscience decision. So that would depend on whether blood circulation is continuous, and that would be discussed, and a Jehovah's Witness would say, yeah, I'll accept that, I won't accept that, depending on their decision. Hemodilution That's another one. I don't want to get into the technicalities, but basically it is what it says. It's like taking your blood and then adding water, putting it back and removing the water. Okay, I've oversimplified, but anyway, you can find out what that is. Heart-lung machines, that's another one. And then you've got things like dialysis. So the key doctrinal question is, does the blood remain in continuous circulation or is it stored? So continuous circulation, that's often conscience. Storage, it's generally prohibited. And you can see already it's a gray area, because as it's traveling down some sort of plastic tube in a continuous cycle, is it stored in that tube, you know? Yeah. So look, remember, we're trying to get into the psychology. I'm trying to document the psychology of a very interesting religion. So here's how the internal logical framework, or Jehovah's Witness reasoning, works. So from Watchtower's internal reasoning, primary components equals blood. Wrong, can't have it. Fractions is derivatives, not blood. Conscience, ding, tick, or possible tick, depending on conscience. The scripture, like we read, forbids blood, not every substance derived from it. Now, I'm not saying right or wrong, I'm just saying from a JW reasoning point of view. Okay? So the conscience applies only after blood is no longer blood. So that's why eating a steak is allowed. The blood's been drained, but there's particles of blood. Eating blood sausage, no, you can't. Or plasma is forbidden, or albumin from plasma may be permitted. Got that? Plasma forbidden, but albumin from plasma may be permitted. So if your mind is struggling with this thing, I empathize, but please stay with me, because we're going to endeavor to really document this. Because there's a practical reality for Jehovah's Witnesses, very, very important in practice to grasp. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses are known for carrying a blood card. It's known as an advance directive. Sometimes the name changes. It just depends. But it's a blood card that essentially shows what the person's wishes are respecting blood or non-blood medical management. And so you've got a situation where a person can put fractions, and yes, in the past it's been individually ticked, yes, no, initialed, whatever. Hospital liaison committees in the past have assisted doctors in navigating acceptable alternatives. And so the line between doctrine and conscience is closely monitored. Welcome to high control religion, folks. Should we do a quick summary? JW doctrinal view of how this works. So maybe you can answer this. Is whole blood acceptable? No. From a JW point of view, no. Okay. How about this? Red cells. Is that acceptable? No. It's forbidden. Okay, how about white cells? No, that's forbidden. How about platelets? No, that's forbidden. Okay, Matt, how about plasma? No, that's forbidden. Okay, what about plasma fractions? Wait a moment. That's conscience. There's a pathway there. How about clotting factors? Oh, it's conscience. Okay. How about immunoglobulins? Yeah, that's conscience. How about continuous circuit procedures? Yeah, that's often conscience. Okay, Matt, how about stored autologous blood? No, that's forbidden. Right, so that is not allowed. It's not permitted. Okay. Now here's a reference, very interesting one. And it is about Elena, a young Christian in Spain. And so here's the reference. Let me read it off. Watchtower 2005, 3/15. So Watchtower 2005, 3/15. And you were bought for a price. Paragraph 8 on page 18. And so Elena, a young Christian in Spain, she had several classmates who were blood donors. They knew that Elena, one of Jehovah's Witnesses, would not donate blood or accept blood transfusions. When an opportunity arose to explain her position to the whole class, Elena volunteered to give a presentation. She says, "Frankly, I felt very nervous about doing this." Elena explains, "But I prepared well and the results were surprising. I won the respect of many of my fellow students, and a teacher told me he admired the work I was doing. Above all, I felt satisfied that I had defended the name of Jehovah and had been able to explain clearly the reasons for my scriptural stand. Yes, as slaves of God in Christ, we stand out as different. However, we may well win people's respect if we are prepared to defend our beliefs respectfully." So that's an interesting one, eh? Watchtower 2005, 3/15. You were bought with a price. Page 18, paragraph 5. So how does this translate into legal language amongst Watchtower, the corporate side, the instrumentality of the Jehovah's Witness faith? How does it compare with Australian Royal Commission testimony versus doctrine? How can we map how medical definitions conflict with religious definitions? How can we distill this into simple terms suitable for doctors or legal correspondence? Well, in this presentation, I want to name all blood fractions. I want to perform a mental exercise, because again we have what I believe is a double binding situation. So from a Jehovah's Witness doctrinal framework, using the way that Watchtower literature itself classifies blood, let's be very clear about what is considered a blood fraction. Not whole blood or a primary component, and therefore a matter of personal conscience. We need to be very honest up front. Watchtower has never published a single finite closed list that is titled all blood fractions. If it has, please tell me in the comments. I'd be interested to know. So I'm not aware of that, okay? What I am aware of is that Watchtower has defined categories. It gives representative examples and then it leaves the rest to conscience as medical science, you can say, evolves. So here's the complete functional list as understood and used in practice. If you want to think about foundational JW classification, Jehovah's Witnesses divide blood into primary components. We said red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, plasma. So everything derived after further fractionalization of these may fall into conscience territory, right? So blood fractions, here's the conscience matters that many Jehovah's Witnesses have a view. 1, fractions derived from plasma. Remember, plasma is forbidden. but fractions from plasma may be acceptable. So commonly cited plasma fractions are albumin, immunoglobulins, antibodies, so you think of IgG, IgA, IgM, IgE, clotting factors including factor 1, fibrinogen derivatives, factor 2, prothrombin derivatives, factor 5, factor 7, factor 8, factor 9, factor 10, factor 11, factor 12, factor 13. Von Willebrand factor, antithrombin 3, protein C, protein S, alpha-1 antitrypsin, complement protein, C1 iterase inhibitor, cryoprecipitate fractions, but not whole cryoprecipitate as a primary component, depending on era or interpretation. You go, Matt, what are you reading out here? Yeah, it's just the list of what is derived from that plasma. Heavy list, eh? Okay, bear with me. Let's go into fractions derived from red blood cells. So red blood cells are forbidden, but fractions extracted from them may be conscience matters. So let's look at examples. Hemoglobin fractions. Yeah. Modified hemoglobin solutions. So that's like hemoglobin-based oxygen carriers, often evaluated individually. Heme-derived compounds, iron-containing heme fractions. It's context-dependent. So Watchtower publications have historically been cautious here, but still classify these as fractions, not whole blood. So far, so good. So we've done plasma, we've done, red blood cells. Let's move on to white blood cells. So white cells are forbidden, but derivatives may be conscience matters. So you've got interferons, interleukins, cytokines, lymphokines, colony stimulating factors. For example, you've got GCSF. Right. Yeah. Monoclonal antibodies, even when originally developed using blood products. What's the point? These are often described as biologic agents, but doctrinally still fall under the fractions derived from blood. Okay. What about fractions derived from platelets? So platelets are forbidden. Derivatives may be conscience matters. What examples do we have? Platelet-derived growth factors, thrombopoietin-related agents, specific platelet protein extracts, and then mixed or ambiguous blood-derived products. That's also conscience. So these are commonly discussed with what was called hospital liaison committees. Fibrin sealants, fibrin glue, that's component derived. Plasma-derived vaccines, fractions only, not whole plasma. Serum-based products, blood-derived enzymes, recombinant products, originally cultured using blood fractions, generally acceptable in JW culture. So here's the important doctrinal principle. That was a tremendous amount to chew through. But using JW logic from Watchtower's standpoint, if a substance is no longer one of the 4 primary components of blood and is present only as a minute fraction, the Christian may decide according to conscience. So, what does this mean? No elder can approve or forbid a specific fraction. Responsibility is placed entirely on the individual witness, Jehovah's Witness, associate, member. So the associate or the member, they are encouraged to do the research. Go look at Awake. But you go to research and they tell you, oh, Awake is not a spiritual magazine. No, it's not a spiritual magazine. No. It's not doctrinal. Watchtower. Watchtower is. Now, yeah, okay. Let me stop there because I'm getting into controversial hot water already. But look, a congregant or an associate or a member is encouraged to go and do research via the Awake. And they assume that that is from Jehovah God, right? Until they are told something very different from research department. And it can be a rude awakening, right? But they're told, go and do research in the publication. So Awake, Watchtower, Hospital, Liaison, Resources, Videos. So if you're looking for a complete official list, you're not going to find one. It's going to be very, very difficult, and I'll tell you why. Because internally, the organization avoids publishing a closed list because, one, medical science keeps producing new derivatives, right? It's changing. Two, a fixed list would create legal and ethical liability, and hey, we don't want to do that. Nope, can't do it. Too complicated. Three, flexibility allows the doctrine to adapt without formal reversal. Four, conscience language shifts accountability to the individual. So how can we summarize this in a sentence? Well, whole blood and its four primary components are forbidden. Fractions derived from those components may be accepted or refused based on personal conscience. So, how does one map what fractions are routinely accepted in an emergency situation? How can we show elders what the instruction is to handle fraction decisions? Somebody in the congregation approaches an elder and says, how does this work? What do they say? I mean, these are the shepherds, these are the teachers. How can we compare medical definitions versus Watchtower definitions? Can we actually precisely phrase this for legal or medical correspondence? Well, my feeling at this stage is that even though we do not have a closed list, it would be really useful to take all these blood fractions listed so far today, mix them together, and calculate the percentage of whole blood. Would we arrive at whole blood if we reverse constituted these components like a jigsaw to try and achieve making a bag of whole blood as a mind exercise? Right? Does this happen in actual real life? It's a mind exercise for the ethics. Okay? I'm trying to do a thought experiment and frame it in a way, not as medicine, but as a conceptual jigsaw. And so that's the lane that we want to try and speak calmly, numerically, and from within the Jehovah's Witness classification framework without critique language. And like I say, I don't know if that's possible, but anyway, let's try. So in other words, can we take all of these little bits and pieces of blood, these parts of components, and add them all up together, and do we get a bag of blood, in other words? Right. So step one, I suppose, would be what whole blood is physically with neutral physiology. So a typical unit of whole human blood by volume is approximately plasma. That's about 55%. Red blood cells, RBCs, that's about 44 to 45%. And then white blood cells plus platelets, that's the less than, is it? less than 1%. I think it's called the Buffy coat. Heard of that? So that's the starting container that we're trying to mentally reassemble. So from all of these fractions, if you add fractions together, like a jigsaw puzzle, would we get that bag of blood? Because remember, we read about, who was it? It was Elena, the young Christian in Spain. She would not donate blood. Wouldn't do it. Okay. It was a no-go area for her. So let's break that down into JW primary components. So using Watchtower's 4 forbidden components: plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. Plasma is 55% of the bag. Red blood cells is 44 to 45%. White blood cells is 0.7%, and platelets is 0.3. That would give us the building blocks in the jigsaw puzzle to bring about a bag of 100% blood. So that's the medical understanding, right? So now step 3, if we fractionate those components, this is the JW conscience space. So plasma fractions, that's the large piece. Plasma itself is 55%, okay, mostly water. But its functional solids are almost entirely fractions that Jehovah's Witnesses explicitly place under conscience. Still with me? Well done. Because your typical plasma constitution or composition is this. Water is 91 to 92% of plasma, leaving you with 7% proteins. Okay. So it's 7% of plasma. Proteins is 7% of plasma. Your other solutes is about 1%, 1 to 2%. Okay, that's what it is. Let me keep to my notes. That's a good habit. So those plasma proteins are precisely the fractions we endeavored to list earlier in the discussion. So albumin, that's 60% of plasma proteins. Immunoglobulins, that's 20%. Clotting factors, that's all the factors combined, that's 4%. And your other regulatory proteins is your 16%. So if we convert that to whole blood percentages, your albumin is 2.5 to 3% of the whole blood. Immunoglobulins is 1 to 1.2%. Clotting factors is 0.2%, and other plasma proteins is 0.6 to 0.8%. Your total plasma derived fractions, 4.5 to 5% of whole blood. Got that? Total plasma derived fractions is 4.5 to 5% of whole blood. So the water portion is about 50% of whole blood. It's not doctrinally restricted at all. But remember, who was it? Eleanor? Could she give blood? No, she couldn't. But anyway, let's press on. Red blood cell fractions. Our red blood cells make up 45% of whole blood. So inside RBCs, red blood cells, you've got hemoglobin. That's 33% of RBC by volume. Your cell membrane proteins, your enzymes, your iron, your heme structures. That's your remainder. So if you fractionate RBCs completely, hemoglobin-derived fractions alone represent 14 to 15% of whole blood. Other RBC protein fractions add another 2 to 3%. So your total RBC-derived fractions is about 16 to 18% of whole blood. All these are classified by Watchtower as fractions, not whole cells. Are you still with me? Wow, I got to thank you. Here we go. White blood cell fractions. White cells are less than 1% of whole blood, and their derived fractions include interferons, interleukins, cytokines, growth factors, monoclonal antibody precursors, and even taken together is less than 0.5% of whole blood. Platelet fractions. Platelets is about 0.3% of whole blood. So their derivatives, their growth factors, clotting mediators is about 0.1 to 0.2 of whole blood, that packet. Are you ready to reassemble the jigsaw, folks? Here's the mind exercise. After all that, let's add up everything that has been classified as fractions in this conversation. Plasma protein fractions, 5%. RBC-derived fractions, 17%. WBC, white blood cell-derived fractions, 0.5%. Platelet-derived fractions, 0.2%. So your total blood-derived fractions is about 22 to 23% of whole blood. There's your packet. See it? Now, let's add the water. That's non-restricted. That's 50%. 50% plus 22 to 23%. So you've got electrolytes, sugars, lipids. That's non-restricted. That's, what, 2 to 3%. You can add that. So your grand total in your packet, your jigsaw, is 74 to 76% of what should otherwise or would otherwise be a whole unit of blood. That's where we are. And this is before considering that many plasma fractions are administered together. Multiple clotting factors can coexist. Hemoglobin-based products may replicate oxygen transport. Eleanor in Spain would not donate blood. So what this shows without commentary, purely as a logical exercise, right? By Jehovah's Witness classification, most of the functional mass of blood can be separated into fractions. When recombined conceptually, those fractions approach the majority of whole blood. The remaining difference is largely cellular structure, not biochemical function. And no judgment. No judgment is needed to observe that this is a classification boundary, not a material one. Matt, can you please simplify? Can you put it into a sentence? Can you try and do it in a neutral way? Please. So, if all currently permitted blood fractions discussed today were hypothetically recombined, they would reconstruct roughly 3/4 of a unit of whole blood by volume, while remaining doctrinally categorized as fractions rather than blood. You got that? As a Jehovah's Witness, remember, whole blood is wrong. But with our jigsaw, we've got about 75%, roughly, right? About 75%, or 3/4 of the way. And those are called fractions. That is a pathway to no tribunal, no judgment. It's a conscience matter. Right. So the questions. How do you put this into Watchtower legal phrasing? How do you map it against Acts 15, which says abstain from blood? How do you map it against that language? How do you compress it into a single paragraph suitable for doctors, courts, or ethics boards? These are very precise questions. And I hope that this video is asking them well. If not, please, in the comments, say, Matt, look, we can build on this video. Let's tighten this video up. You know, you've spun out of control, Matt. And I will do better in future. That will be my endeavor. So let's go to the initial prohibition on whole blood. Could a Jehovah's Witness, like our example Eleanor in the outset in Spain, could a Jehovah's Witness like Eleanor donate their blood, for instance, so that this grand total, the 75%, the 74 to 75 to 76%, which would otherwise be a whole unit of blood, could she donate it so that it could be produced? The Watchtower said she would not donate blood. So I would like to believe that we're getting to a precisely framed follow-on question. One that we can try to answer cleanly from Jehovah's Witness doctrinal position, from their psychology, from the psychology, from my psychology, being a Jehovah's Witness, being trained in that society. Can I do it without drifting into critique or speculation? Well, already my face and my body language betrays me, doesn't it? Because the short answer from a JW doctrinal view is no. What? What, man? I've forgotten the question. A Jehovah's Witness may not donate whole blood or any of the four primary components for any purpose, including so that others might later separate it into permissible fractions. Yeah, it's a no. So the answer no, step by step, using JW reasoning, non-apostate, using JW reasoning, the prohibition applies to the act of giving blood, not only receiving it. So from the Watchtower standpoint, the command to abstain from blood applies to taking blood into the body, storing blood, giving blood to be used by others. A blood donation is therefore viewed as actively handling and transferring blood, which violates abstention, regardless of end use. So even if the donor never receives blood, the blood is separated into four fractions. The fractions might later be acceptable to someone else, but the initial act is still prohibited. We've got our reference. So the whole and primary components are never conscience matters. What are they? Whole blood, forbidden. Red cells, forbidden. White cells, absolutely forbidden. Platelets, forbidden. Plasma, forget it, it's forbidden. Because these are never conscience matters, a witness cannot authorize their use in any direction, in or out. Fractions do not retroactively sanctify the original blood. This is an important internal principle in JW logic. Now I'm going to get into why this is not discussed. I'll get there. Again, bear with me. Let's get the video out there and see if we can simplify later on. But let's keep plowing ahead. Excuse me. In JW logic, fractions only exist after blood has already been violated. That's it. A prohibited act cannot be justified by a later acceptable use. So the reasoning is, I cannot give blood even if someone else later extracts only what they may accept by conscience. How are they going to get it? How are they going to get that, 74, 75, 76%? How are they going to get there? So here's the psychology. You ready for the mental gymnastics? Ethics elastic? The moral responsibility from a Jehovah's Witness point of view is attached to the donor's act, not the recipient's choice. The donor sinned. Shucks, eh? I'm not supposed to critique, eh? Like I said, I'll try. I'll try. I'm sorry. So the analogy that's used internally, it's not a critique, it's just an explanation. But I know that it is a critique, eh? Watchtower literature has historically reasoned along this line. If blood is forbidden to consume, it's also forbidden to supply. So just as one would not provide blood sausage ingredients, even if someone else filtered them later, it's just off limits. So again, the emphasis is on abstaining, not optimizing outcomes. So what about donating fractions directly? This is where the nuance exists, because donating whole blood or primary components is not allowed, but accepting fractions, oh well, that's conscience. Ding, tick. But donating fractions, who's ever done it? How do you donate a fraction? It's rarely discussed. It's generally treated as discouraged or problematic. And so in practice, it's avoided. And this is where now you go to a loving shepherd for direction. Can they give you answers? So why is discussion avoided? I'll tell you why. Because most fractions require industrial blood pooling. Yeah. So I'm going to say, what Bethel would do that? What congregation would do this? Come on, folks, let's pool blood. The reality is donation pipelines almost always involve whole blood collection. Witnesses are counseled to keep far away from blood use, not merely avoid transfusion. So while the doctrine is explicit about accepting fractions, it's not framed as an encouragement to participate in the blood supply chain. So when we have done our jigsaw, our reconstruction thought experiment, what did our early findings say? It said, well, 74, 75, 76% of whole blood can be functionally reconstituted as a bag of blood. There you go, 75%, folks. Oof. And it's reconstituted from fractions. But from a JW doctrinal standpoint, no Jehovah's Witness, no witness may initiate the process by donating whole blood, even if the end result constitutes only of, or consists of, what did I say? Conscience permitted fractions. No witness can donate whole blood. It just can't do it, even if the end result consists only of conscience permitted fractions. The prohibition applies at the source. So here we go. One sentence, Matt. Please simplify. Okay. A Jehovah's Witness may not donate whole blood or primary components under any circumstances, even if that blood would later be separated into fractions that others might accept by conscience. So, how do we compare donation versus disposal logic? How do we examine autologous storage that's treated differently? How do we express informal Watchtower legal language? You know, this is where a thinking person just gets into trouble. Because if they show any kind of exceptional clarity on these kind of things, you're stepping on a minefield within JW culture. So look, what's the problem? The problem is you have a culture, you have a doctrine that has a punishable element running through it. You've got Jehovah's Witness tribunals. You've got, elders committee, shunning. If you are involved in this whole blood, you're going to get into trouble, right? It's against God, and it's against the religious high control religion. So Jehovah's Witnesses say, look, it's wrong to take whole blood, but blood fractions, you've got a path. You've got a path to take it without tribunal or God's wrath, adding up to the 74, 75, 76% of whole blood. Jehovah's Witnesses prohibits any Jehovah's Witness giving blood. However, it's able to take up to 76% without inciting God's wrath or that of elders. So I think, look, is it therefore in Jehovah's Witness' best interest to have a world that is scheduled to be destroyed, which supplies what they want via violation of present doctrine? Okay, this is why I get headaches. So if all the planet eventually became Jehovah's Witnesses, who supplied their fractions for the survivors if it's prohibited? So I'd like to believe that now if you have really stuck it out in this long form video, if you stuck it out this far, we've now reached the core internal tension of the doctrine. And so let's try and answer this carefully. Let's try and still, even if I've crossed the line, let's try and pull it back neutrally and analytically. Okay? Let's not, I'm saying this for myself, let's not get into inflammatory language. Okay? Let's just try and clearly distinguish what Jehovah's Witnesses would say. And I realize this can be triggering. Yeah, so that's my disclaimer. Okay? Let's see what Jehovah's Witnesses would say from what logically follows from the structure of the doctrine. So, no rhetoric. Let's try this. Let's state the situation accurately. So within Jehovah's Witness framework, all of the following are simultaneously true, such as taking whole blood is a serious sin. It's enforced by congregational discipline. Okay? You watched. Accepting many blood fractions is permitted by conscience. There's no judicial or elders committee penalty. No. Donating whole blood is prohibited, regardless of end use. Blood fractions exist only because someone else donated the whole blood. Okay? So a Jehovah's Witness may benefit from those fractions without sin or discipline. But they can go and call on that person in the house-to-house work or in the preaching work and say, well, listen, you should become a Jehovah's Witness. You ought to repent. But I essentially put you into that situation, or I benefited from your situation. Okay. So look, the 74 to 76% bag, the reconstruction, okay, that jigsaw puzzle. It makes the structural reality visible. It doesn't create it. So how do Jehovah's Witnesses do the mental gymnastics? How do they internally resolve this? What's the explanation? This is where you've just got to say it's incredible. It's amazing. Because the moral responsibility is individualized. So they would say, well, look, each person answers to God, to Jehovah, only for their own actions. It's their actions. So they answer. The non-Jehovah's Witness donor, the school child or wherever they harvest the blood from, the non-Jehovah's Witness donor answers for donating blood. That's their story. That's their problem. Right? The Jehovah's Witness recipient answers only for what they accept. And so the moral chain is intentionally not extended backward. So this principle is used throughout Watchtower ethics. This is why people go crazy with it. They struggle, they grapple with it. Okay? Food, employment, taxes, medical systems. Right? Education. Because, yeah, okay. Each person answers to God only for their own actions. So fractions are treated as morally transformed substances. So doctrinally, whole blood is sacred. It's life, sacred life. Fractions, these derivatives, they no longer carry that sacred status. So once they're separated, they're treated similar to medications, vaccines. This is how we get to vaccines, folks. Hormones and enzymes. So witnesses would say, oh, we're not benefiting from blood, we're benefiting from medicine. It's clean. Got that? We're not benefiting from blood. We are benefiting from medicine. And the system is seen as temporary. So Jehovah's Witnesses believe, well, the world is under Satan's control. It's an imperfect system. It's going to continue until divine intervention. That's it. Jehovah God's permitting temporary contradictions for now. So, reliance on non-Jehovah's Witness medical systems is framed as temporary necessity, but I will say that we do have Jehovah's Witness medical systems. South Africa branch is an example of that. It's got its own Jehovah's Witness doctors. But anyway. Essentially, I want to say that in this thesis or this presentation, the reliance on non-Jehovah's Witness medical systems is framed as a temporary necessity, not an ideal arrangement. That's the way it gets through. Now here's the unavoidable logical implication that I'm going to try and neutrally state. Even if one accepts Jehovah's Witness premises, you say, well, I'm sticking with this. Come what may. Matt Gray, you make an appeal permanently to governing body to remain a Jehovah's Witness. You will face the discipline. You will be a misfit of society. You just get into trouble the whole time. You're in the gulag. If one fully accepts Jehovah's Witness premises, the following logically follows. If everyone followed Jehovah's rules, Jehovah's Witness rules perfectly, no one could donate whole blood. Therefore, because no one can donate whole blood, no blood fractions could be produced. Therefore, Jehovah's Witnesses' acceptable blood fractions would cease to exist. It's not an accusation. It's just a systems dependency observation. So the doctrine functions only in a mixed moral ecosystem. And so how's this handled without saying it explicitly? Well, the organization avoids confronting this directly by never encouraging donation of fractions, never mapping fractions back to donor sources, avoiding aggregate analysis like the 74, 75, 76% exercise where we've got all these building blocks and jigsaw puzzle bringing up this bag. Okay? Placing decisions at the individual conscience level is how it's handled, and keeping enforcement focused on transfusion, not on supply chains. Yeah. So this prevents the question that's being asked from arising inside the system. Boom, shut down. So the point about best interests and destruction, okay, where the world is going to be destroyed at Armageddon, or by Jehovah God, or by his kingdom. Jehovah's Witness psychology says that, we reject this idea because we desire a world that, is perfect. So Jehovah's Witnesses generally reject the idea that they desire a world that violates their doctrine for their benefit. Got that? Let me explain. They'd say that God tolerates current contradictions temporarily. Yeah. What's the problem, folks? Jehovah tolerates it. We tolerate it. But we don't tolerate... Okay. God tolerates current contradictions temporarily. In the new world, disease is going to end. Blood products will no longer be needed. And the issue becomes irrelevant. So from a Jehovah's Witness view, you see the gymnastics, the mental gymnastics. The view is that dependency is temporary and permitted. It's not desired or exploited. And that's how you can still have tribunal and punishment for donating of blood and for taking whole blood. Okay. So let's try and phrase this in neutral language. The current blood doctrine permits individual witnesses to accept a large proportion of blood-derived therapies while prohibiting participation in the processes that make those therapies available. It's a structure that functions only within the broader non-witness medical system. Does that state the reality without assigning motive or intent? So here's the final clarity point, if there is such a thing. We're not asking a hostile question. We're just asking a system ethics question. And boy, is our broadcast all about ethics these days. Because the honest answer is yes, the doctrine relies on a world that does not follow it. No, the organization does not openly acknowledge or analyze their reliance. Oh, how did we get a vaccine? How did we get this fraction? But in our reconstruction of this jigsaw, put it all together, it shows that the reliance is visible. The visibility exists inside official JWD discourse like this, but it is shut down. This is a no-go area. So can you translate it into formal legal style language? Can you compare it to other religious medical exemptions? Can we explore how conscience is used as a liability boundary? Can we be methodical? Can we remain respectful? Can we remain exacting? Because this is where the questioning lands. So what happens to an earnest elder who receives genuine questions from a congregant who is seeking to try and fathom the spiritual ethics so that they can make a conscience-based choice? I'm going to give an example. Sister Susie Sue. Sister Susie Sue, she approaches Brother Elder Joey Joe for a discussion that we've had. Brother Joey Joe, he lacks the expertise. to answer her. And so places Sister Susie Sue's questions and logic on the elderly's quarterly meeting agenda. Submits it. There you go, Kobe. Put it on the agenda. Coordinator of the body of elders. Please put it on their quarterly agenda. I'm going to ask the question, what happens to the elder for doing this? Because this is very, very important. It's a very realistic question. And I'm asking it with fairness towards all parties involved. Because I'd like to answer it from inside what's happening in the Jehovah's Witness organization. Reality, not hypotheticals. And I want to be very careful as to what's written and what's practiced. Let's distinguish it. And what the elder personally experiences. Because welcome to hell, folks. Okay, I've crossed the line. Sorry. Welcome to the difficulty. Because the short, honest answer is, an elder who formally escalates this kind of structured ethical questioning to an elders meeting places himself under scrutiny, even if his motives are sincere and pastoral. When persons are made elders, they get down and cry. Oh, boo-hoo, wow, I've been chosen. Yeah, you hear of this and you go, oh, what a humble brother, what a good attitude he has. You can see the emphasis that's placed on this. So, the elder, he escalates it, sends it in. But as he does it, he puts himself under the scrutiny. Even if his motives are sincere, pastoral. Yeah, he's unlikely to be punished immediately, but from this point on, he's quietly evaluated for spiritual safety. And I'll tell you why, because we're going to walk through this step by step. Here's the evaluation of what happens in the scenario. Okay? It's plausible. It's dangerous inside the system. Sister Susie Sue, she's not rebellious. She's not. She's not promoting apostasy. She's seeking to make a conscience-based decision. She doesn't know. She hasn't had the education. So she brings a logical, internally consistent ethical query to the elder. I'm inquiring, how does this work? And the elder doesn't answer independently. He's responsibly raising it with the body of elders. How does this work? Why? From an external perspective, he is actually performing exemplary pastoral conduct. But from an internal Jehovah's Witness government's perspective, beep, 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 red alert, yeah, it's triggering the alarm. And this is what elders are trained to do. Officially, elders are trained that doctrine is settled, conscience applies only where the organization explicitly says it applies. The role of elders is to protect unity, not to explore unresolved ethics. Please get this in your heads, folks. The role of elders is to protect unity, not to explore unresolved ethics. Questions are not neutral. They must be categorized. So when an elder introduces this topic in an elders meeting, the first internal question is not, is this ethically coherent? It's, oh, why is this being asked? And so what happens in the elders meeting realistically, and this is the experience, my experience for these kind of situations, not this, I've got my own experiences, but this is a typical kind of situation. The likely progression based on known elders' manuals, training culture and practice, and many experiences, is the question is reframed immediately. The body tries to remove the system's ethics. It removes the aggregation logic. It removes the reconstruction argument. And they simply reduce it to, oh, does Sister Susie Sue understand that blood fractions are a conscience matter? If the question can be collapsed into that, they'll do so. So the attention shifts subtly from Sister Susie Sue to Brother Joey Joe. Because if Brother Joey Joe says, oh, I couldn't answer this, seems logically unresolved, or it felt like it needed discussion, guess what happens? Wrong! Signaling. It's signaling uncertainty about doctrinal sufficiency, and that's the pivot point. The elder's spiritual discernment is assessed. Without saying it openly, the body is going to evaluate, oh, does this elder accept and trust the governing body? Does it accept that Jehovah clarifies matters progressively? Is he waiting upon Jehovah? Is he avoiding independent ethical synthesis? Or is he leaning on human reasoning? Is he going beyond what's written and opening doors unnecessarily? There's no accusation yet, but categorization is beginning. That's what's happening. This is what does not happen. He's not immediately removed. No. He's not charged in a tribunal. No. He's not accused of apostasy. He's not condemned for helping a sister. The system is subtler than that. What does happen to the elder is this: over time, one or more of the following usually happens. He's counseled privately. He's often told, oh, well, you know, you don't have to overthink this, brother. The organization's already addressed it. Oversight's got it in hand. You just keep the answers simple. Be careful not to confuse the sheep. You know, we notice you confusing the sheep here. He's just going, what? Yeah, that's the boundary setting moment. So he's quietly discouraged from future escalation. He might be told, look, refer such questions to published material. We better not hear about this again. Avoid group discussion of hypotheticals. If we hear that this is happening out in field service or in a group or in some social setting, you're in for it. We don't want to hear this. Keep conscience matters personal, not analytical. We don't care if Sister Susie Sue comes. Just brush her off. That's the extent of the pastoral care. She's earnestly coming forward. He doesn't know. He goes to the elders. He goes, well, geez, do I even mention this again? You know, I've been given a yellow card here. Just now I'm going to get a red card and I'm off the pitch. So look, the elder's future fitness is going to be watched. So if he continues to raise unresolved ethical questions, differing questions, he's going to be seen as a problem. And this is going to create this doctrinal tension. If he encourages or is seen to encourage deep conscience reasoning, over time, he's not going to be recommended for further responsibility. He's going to be given the most rubbish assignments you can ever imagine. They're going to try and break him. I'm telling you now. They're going to send him to awful places. This is what happens. This is how people are broken. Not recommended for further responsibility, given no perks, nothing. He just slogs it. He slogs it until he breaks. And in those circles, they're just going to say, oh, he's not well balanced. You know, he's intellectually restless. No punishment is needed. It's contained. That's how it's done. And why this happens, what is the internal psychology, the internal logic from the organization's point of view? Well, ethical coherence is less important than unity. No, we're not interested. Unity is more important. Open-ended moral inquiry threatens predictability. Blood, it's tied to identity and loyalty. Oh, questions like that, what's it, 74 to 75% analysis or that examination? No, that's destabilizing. No, throw that out. We don't like that. No. So elders are trained implicitly to protect the boundary, not to explore the edge. There's no spiritual growth with this. Forget it. No. And that's the quiet tragedy that's happening, because the elder didn't do anything morally wrong. He was acting as a shepherd. He didn't do anything wrong pastorally. He didn't do anything wrong procedurally. But he touched a nerve. It was a question that cannot be answered fully. It cannot be discussed openly. It cannot be resolved without acknowledging dependency. And he's just not included in the NDA, non-disclosure agreements, and the protections that the higher tiers can have. No. And that makes the question itself a risk. So here's the summary. An elder who escalates unresolved ethical questions about blood fractions acts conscientiously but exposes himself to scrutiny, boundary setting, and gradual marginalization if he persists. Yeah? So elders are trained to deflect conscience inquiries. Language is used to close questions without answering them. Sister Susie Sue, you just left out. Sorry, you got a crisis? You deal with it yourself. It's between you and Jehovah, but woe betide you, we're watching you. If this swings this way, we're on to you. If it swings this way and it creates a liability, we're on to you. So I want to say, please, I hope that this kind of question or this kind of analysis is going to help future generations or people currently to see what many are failing to articulate, and that this actually matters. Because I want to add to the situation. What if Sister Susie Sue is a full-time regular pioneer and a branch volunteer, like a commuter? So they've entered into special service. But Sister Susie Sue has an 18-year-old daughter who has a health crisis, for instance, whereby blood, its fractions are involved and are actually being recommended psychologically by many healthcare professionals, including Jehovah's Witness branch doctors with current licenses, who say that yes, 76% of blood can be used as long as it's in the fractional forms. And it confuses Sister Susie Sue. She's just going, I've been counseled for this and I've been counseled for that, and I had to really earn my way to get to Bethel and to be a pioneer, and I couldn't qualify for years, and man, I've been in the back room and suffered. She just says, well, what do I do? She's confused. Not this pastoral elder that's confused her. This situation has confused her. Her lived experience is creating a confusion. Because she finds herself now caring for her, correctly, 18-year-old family child who's in a crisis, right? Health crisis. Maybe the child still lives in Sister Susie Sue's property, or under her roof, so to speak, even if it's a flat or a cottage, but it's on her property. And Sister Susie Sue is needing quick experience pastoral care for a difficult time-sensitive situation. And Elder Joey Joe is asked, why is he pressing the issue with the elders? Why is this question being asked? Oh, and Sister Susie Sue has said to Brother Elder Joey Joe, please can you keep this confidential? And Sister Susie Sue is asking on behalf of her now incapacitated daughter. It's a crisis situation. This is not just hypothetical. This happens inside Jehovah's Witness systems. It's exactly the kind of high-pressure convergence where doctrine, conscience, family authority, and time collide. So let's be realistic. Let's not be idealistic here. Let's try and stay within organizational behavior, not speculation. Let's break it into what officially should happen and what actually happens and what happens to each person involved. So the gravity of the situation internally is inside the Jehovah's Witness framework. This is a tier 1 crisis. A special full-time servant, a regular pioneer, a commuter, a branch-connected individual has a medical emergency. An adult child who's still dependent and under parental influence. Yeah, it's come into this gray area, you want to say. Okay, blood doctrine is involved. Hospital liaison committees, or what was hospital liaison committee elders. Maybe those are the persons that are present. Maybe those are the persons with the experience that is present in this particular body of elders. And it's a time-sensitive decision-making situation. Elder Joey Joe, he's already breached the confidentiality. He thinks he's being confidential by telling the other elders because he can't cope. He hasn't got the brain power to be able to deal with this. He hasn't got the answers. And that's not his fault. He's been compartmentalized. It's not just a conscience discussion. It's become a risk management event. So what is supposed to happen? The official narrative. is that the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses teaches that medical decisions are personal conscience matters. Elders should provide spiritual comfort, not coercion. You think. Parents must not be pressured. The patient's wishes should be respected. Hospital liaison committees, or whatever they are now, exist to support, not control. So on paper, Sister Susie Sue should receive calm reassurance, scriptural encouragement, clear explanation that fractions are a conscience matter, and freedom to decide without fear of discipline. That's the published ideal. But what actually happens in practice, and this is the critical section, is because of who Susie Sue is, Sister Susie Sue, the dynamics change immediately because her status works against her here. Why? Because she's a regular pioneer. She's in special service. She's in full-time service. She's a branch adjacent volunteer. She's known. She's visible. She's not just treated as a private publisher. Her decision is precedent setting. It's symbolic, it's reputational, and it raises the stakes dramatically. So the moment that Elder Joey Joe names her confidentially, there is no confidentiality. It collapses. So even if he was asked to keep confidence, once he actually discloses to elders where he thinks he's still keeping confidence, several things happen instantly. The issue is no longer abstract. The sister is now identified as struggling, the situation is now trackable, and responsibility shifts from support to containment. There's no malice required. Structural. So the role of the HLC elders, or whatever that becomes, now dominates, because the HLC elders, those with that experience, they're present on the same body, the pastoral lane narrows, and the HLC elders are trained to prevent prohibition transfusions, prohibited transfusions. They must prevent it. They're trained to interface with doctors to ensure doctrinal compliance and minimize organizational risk. They're not trained to explore ethical paradoxes under pressure. It's not their role. Yeah. So the discussion will be steered toward fractions are a conscience matter. You don't need to overthink this. Jehovah understands your stress. Let's focus on acceptable alternatives. And so the deeper logical tension is quietly set aside. And so what Sister Susie Sue experiences emotionally and spiritually, this is the most human part and the most painful. Because she's now responsible for her child's life. She's now under time pressure, surrounded by authority figures, hearing it's your conscience, while sensing unspoken expectations. She's aware that her decision could affect her service, her reputation, her standing, her future assignments. And it creates conscience compression, a narrowing of real freedom under urgency. And so what happens to Elder Joey Joe now? Well, Elder Joey Joe has crossed the line, not doctrinally, but procedurally. Immediate consequences is he's seen as too transparent. He's revealed a vulnerable sister. He's introduced structural critique under crisis. So he's likely going to be counseled about discretion, told not to complicate matters, reminded to trust existing arrangements. But longer term, he's going to be watched. He's going to be less likely to be consulted on sensitive cases, and he's going to be gently sidelined from, hospital liaison committee type adjacent matters. No disciplines needed. Trust is simply reallocated. So what happens if Sister Susie Sue chooses the fractions likely outcome? Well, if she agrees to fraction-based treatments, there's no judicial action, no formal discipline, no announcement, no record, but the story will be known informally. Her resilience under trial may be praised. or if discomfort lingers, her special service roles in future may quietly change. Nothing overt, nothing administrative. But what happens if she hesitates or questions openly? That's the danger zone. If she continues to articulate the logical conflict because she feels she didn't get the proper answers from the elders, and she therefore expresses distress about dependency on non-Jehovah's Witness donors and says, well, how did they donate this stuff so that we get all these fractions? This is a no-go. If she seeks further clarification beyond the reassurance, then the focus shifts from the crisis to her stability. She may be encouraged to simplify. Elders may be brought in, and her sustainable for special service may be reviewed, not as punishment, but as protective governance. So here's a sentence that captures the reality. In a medical crisis involving blood fractions, a high-profile Jehovah's Witness receives support only so long as her conscience decision does not expose unresolved doctrinal tensions or threaten organizational predictability. I hope that sentence is descriptive, not accusatory. And why does it matter so much? Because this is exactly the kind of situation where conscience is said to be free. But functionally it's constrained. Not by cruelty, not by individual elders, but by role, visibility, time pressure, and institutional self-protection. So how do we trace what happens in the next 6 months later? How do we produce or examine support language, or look at the support language that masks the pressure? How do we model what a truly neutral pastoral response could look like? Because I tell you what, I think of Sister Susie Sue. She realizes her questions how Jehovah's Witnesses can use fractions which have been harvested by the world, as Jehovah's Witnesses say, outside of Jehovah's Witness culture, the world, which is scheduled for destruction. She realizes that her questions on how Jehovah's Witnesses use fractions, which have been harvested from the world, donating whole blood, are just not being answered. She was told prior to 2025 that, higher education would remove her qualifications. Now, during 2025, it's changed. So higher education that would remove her qualifications of service and would be announced to the congregation that she no longer qualifies or has been removed, meaning that congregants instantly become distrustful of her, especially when she bursts into tears at any such announcement, which is invariably what happens. Some elders on the body speak to their wives about confidential matters. Yeah, it happens. They're not supposed to, but it happens. Or an elder leaks the story as congregants offer care in inquiry because they know of the crisis or of some of the details, or they themselves tried to advise Sister Susie Sue and they got into a mess. Meanwhile, Sister Susie Sue, she knows that it's morally wrong in her mind to put anyone, both Jehovah's Witness or non-Jehovah's Witness, into a situation where giving blood is wrong to get that 75%. She doesn't want a non-Jehovah's Witness to become guilty or cause that person to become guilty. She's likely going to call on them in the field service. So Sister Susie Sue feels that elder doctors who are now saying that, 76% fractions are okay, she starts thinking, well, actually, I think that's the devil in Jehovah's house causing misleading, inspired utterances. So her whole life of courage, she courageously declines anything to do with blood. She decides, I'm going to use my conscience. I'm going to say no. Anything to do with blood at all for both Jehovah's Witness and non-Jehovah's Witness conscience and my ethics, as trained by biblical reading in the Jehovah's Witness sphere. My daughter's doctors, meanwhile, they are waiting an answer from Sister Susie Sue, or from her, from me. in the story. They want to know how to treat the daughter with non-blood medical management and alternatives, but it's creating a frantic situation. So the doctor now frantically endeavors to fight back because they feel that they're limited in their ethics and that Sister Susie Sue's daughters become critical. They try to use courts to emergency overrule Sister Susie Sue's conscience decision. And meanwhile in this mess, Sister Susie Sue's daughter dies. Now a whole investigation ensues. And Sister Susie Sue is potentially prosecuted for negligence of her family responsibilities, or it's implied, or potential liabilities suddenly come in, and questions about her effectiveness as being a parent, and all of that comes in. So whatever the case or accusation, she's asked why she allowed this situation to occur and why she decided in conscience to hold fast to an absolutely no blood or fraction treatment. She says, I'm a Jehovah's Witness, and this is my faith-based decision on account of Acts chapter 15, the prohibition and the wrongness of donating blood as upheld and enforced by elders among Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jehovah's Witness elders are approached and they deny this. They say that they told her that up to 76% of fractions were available to her, but she made her conscience-based choice, and now it's brought about terrible consequences. So what happens next? So this is heavy. So let's be sober, let's be structural, because what we describe sits at the intersection of religious doctrine, conscience, parental duty, institutional self-protection, and the law. So we can't dramatize the death itself, because it happens. So we've got to just focus on what follows. So, I don't know, 4 arenas, because this is how it unfolds in reality. 1, the criminal, civil, legal area. 2, the medical, ethical arena. 3, the Jehovah's Witness organizational arena. And 4, the personal and social aftermath for Sister Susie Sue. And I'll be very clear where responsibility is deflected and where it lands. Because what happens legally is this. It's decisive. The core legal question is not theology. It's this. Did Sister Susie Sue act reasonably, in good faith and in accordance with accepted standards when making medical decisions for her dependent child? Courts do not adjudicate doctrine. They adjudicate duty of care. So the prosecution's likely framing, they'll argue, well, the child was critically ill. Yeah, I was 18 years, but still a child. Medical professions recommend treatments that were lawful, widely accepted, explicitly permitted within the mother's own religion, and Sister Susie Sue's refused all blood and fractions. That refusal materially contributed to the child's death. So crucially, they'll emphasize this was not required by her religion. So that sentence is the pivot. So what happens to her faith defense? When Sister Susie Sue says, I'm a Jehovah's Witness and this is my faith-based decision, the court's going to ask, well, is this belief? Is this officially required? Is this universally enforced? Is it non-negotiable with the faith? And this is where the elders' statements, the Jehovah's Witness elders' statements, become determinative. Because the role of the elders' testimony, and this is where the fracture occurs, is the elders' institutional response is predictable. They'll state truthfully from their manuals, whole blood is prohibited. Primary components are prohibited. Blood fractions are a matter of personal conscience. Yeah. So Sister Susie Sue was not required to refuse fractions. So no elder instructed her to refuse all treatment. They're going to say she acted independently. Okay? So this is not cruelty, this is organizational self-preservation. So the effect of that testimony in court. Once the elders say this, the court concludes, oh, well, her decision was idiosyncratic, it wasn't mandatory, it exceeded the requirement of her faith, therefore it's not protected as a compelled religious practice. It's treated as a personal ethical choice. And she thinks that she's got the protection of the congregation, which has said, oh, by the way, make your own decision according to your Bible-trained conscience. It is quite an awakening when the individual realizes that the shift of liability is squarely on that person. They were told, oh, the congregation loves you. They will die for you. The individuals will die for you. Let me repeat. The court says this was their own personal ethical choice. Sister Susie Sue, you made your own personal ethical choice. The liability is on you. Now, why must the JW organization deny responsibility? Why does it happen? And again, perhaps we should just say that these kind of double binds happen in all sorts of situations. But look, today, this blood issue is pretty much unique to Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay? So why can we say or ask, rather, why the organization must deny responsibility? The Jehovah's Witness organization, its various instrumentalities. So let's explore that, because if the organization were to say, yes, this refusal was required by our doctrine. Yes, the Bible says abstain from blood. She abstained totally. She took it to the proper degree. This would expose themselves to civil liability. Yeah. Potentially. It could open up wrongful death claims, state scrutiny, potential loss of charitable status. Oh, that's going to hurt. And then, here's another one. Mandatory reporting and regulation. So they cannot say that. Even if culturally, spiritually, or psychologically the pressure was real. And this is where we get to now what happens medically and ethically after the fact. So medical review boards will likely conclude, well, doctors acted appropriately. Courts attempted emergency intervention. Non-blood alternatives were attempted, and the limitation was parental refusal. Doesn't mean that there's hostility from doctors, that the doctors are hostile to the faith. No. It means that the standard of care was constrained. So that again reinforces that this was a parental decision, or somebody who fell into that family line of responsibility. Maybe it's not a daughter, maybe it's another relative, but the responsibility was there. And so they say, well, this was a parental or a familial decision, not a medical failure. But now what happens to Sister Susie Sue inside the JW community? Well, this is the most painful irony. She's not praised. She's not praised as a martyr. She's not celebrated. Why? Because her action conflicts with official flexibility. It draws legal attention. It creates reputational risk. So she will likely be described quietly as, overly rigid, kind of fanatical, not balanced, acting beyond direction. That's what happens. Yeah, you know what? Shame. She was emotionally overwhelmed. Yeah. And her service status will almost certainly change. Not as punishment, but as a practical adjustment. Yeah. Special service will end, pioneer status may quietly lapse, we're not going to be helpful to keep her going, no dramatic announcements needed, concern, we're concerned, we want to express our concern about her well-being. And so this reframes her from example to cautionary case. How many have we got of these? So the social consequences are heavy because you've got leaks, you've got whispers, you've got narrative control, so some congregants are going to pity her. Is that cool? Some are going to distance themselves. Is that cool? Some will silently blame her. Not cool. And very few will defend her publicly. And importantly, how many elders are going to say, oh, she was right? Chances are no elder. And no elder is going to say we pressured her. It's going to be rare. No elder is going to say, oh, well, the doctrine is unclear. Silence is safety. Far, far safer. And you hear elders talk, you hear them talk like this, oh, we dodged a bullet. And you go, so you knew. You knew. So what happens doctrinally? Nothing. No clarification, no policy change, no acknowledgement of tension, no admission of moral paradox. The organization will treat this as, well, this was a tragic personal circumstance involving a conscience decision. Let's move on. So the final unavoidable reality is this, and this is the hardest truth. Again, how do I state this neutrally and precisely? Maybe that ship has sailed. I don't know. But the doctrine allows individual conscience, but the institution disclaims responsibility for the consequences of that conscience when it produces legally or socially costly outcomes. Sister Susie Sue is left holding the grief, the legal exposure, the moral weight, the public narrative, and is alone. So, this has been a presentation where we try and wrap things up in sentences. So here's one. Here's a sentence to try and capture the outcome. Ready for this? When a Jehovah's Witness exercises conscience more strictly than the organization requires, the individual bears the full cost, while the institution retains full deniability. Shall I explain this? Well, if you want, perhaps we could compare this with other religions or other high control situations or other refusal cases. Or perhaps we could examine how conscience functions as a liability firewall. Or perhaps better yet, maybe we can articulate how this could be presented in expert testimony or analysis. But I want to say this gently but clearly. What we're describing here is not extreme. It's what happens when sincere belief collides with institutional ambiguity under crisis. Who's feeling this is by design? So, if we removed the JW Tribunal If we removed the judgmental aspect, the disciplinary aspect, the elders' committees, how does this alter the dynamics? How does Susie Sue, Sister Susie Sue, process the situation? What happens if Jehovah's Witnesses as an organization were to openly tell her of the contradiction of non-Jehovah's Witnesses donating blood, yet they're saying one has a conscience pathway to taking up to 76% of that donated blood in the form of fractions, and that no active JW can supply the whole blood to make those fractions? Let's say it was upfront. I hope that we're now getting to excellent reframing. I hope. And if not, I'd like to know how to. Because by removing the tribunal aspect, the judgment pressure, what is this whole story exposing? I hope it's exposing what is structural versus what is coercive. And this is important. This is very, very important. Because I'm going to try and answer this calmly, analytically, try, and show how the dynamics genuinely change. And also what does not resolve still, even in the best care version of what we're proposing or where this is leading to. So let's try and break it up into two parts. What changes if Jehovah's Witness tribunals and disciplinary fears removed? Second part. What changes if the organization openly acknowledges the contradictions that we're naming here? The double bind, the catch-22 situation. Okay, so let's look at part one. So removing the tribunal judgment aspect, because you hear a person say, remove the shunning, remove the shunning, remove the shunning. So let's be very clear. In removing the tribunal judgment aspect, the punishment does not remove doctrine, but it radically alters the psychological and ethical pressure. So what immediately changes for Sister Susie Sue? Well, without fear of disfellowshipping, removal, okay, that's what it is now. Loss of service status, congregational shunning, spiritual reputational damage. It's the social side, isn't it? Well, she gains time. She can think without panic. That's wonderful now. She's got cognitive breadth. She can hold paradox and do so without collapsing into absolutism. There's moral flexibility. She can weigh outcomes instead of policing purity. And relational safety. She can ask questions without fear of being labeled unsafe. She can go to that elder and talk, you know. So in practical terms, her conscience becomes deliberate, not defensive. She's no longer forced into an all or nothing ethics situation. The urgency no longer converts ambiguity into this rigidity. So this alone often prevents the tragic hardening that can happen in the situation. You now have a religion, a religious society that's able to elevate itself. Many may say, Matt, you're living in a dream world, but remember, this is an exercise. So what changes now for elders and, let's say, those that were involved in HLC, Hospital Liaison Committee members? Okay, so let's explore it. So without tribunals, elders no longer act as gatekeepers. Your HLC elders become consultants, not enforcers. Yeah. Radical, eh? Confidentiality breaches lose their power as leverage. And there's less incentive to simplify or deflect questions. So crucially, elders no longer need to protect the organization from the associate, from the member, from the congregant, from the pioneer, from Sister Susie Sue. And this is tectonic plates moving, the seismic shift. Okay, because now we can say, oh, this is ethically complex. You're allowed to say it. You're allowed to say, oh, the literature doesn't fully resolve this. You might hear that, but it can come out into the open now. You can now hear, oh, this is what we know, and here is what we don't know. Wow. Thank you. So even now, acknowledging the uncertainty becomes safe. But, okay, what still remains difficult, and this is important. So even with your tribunals removed, Doctrine still defines blood as sacred. Okay? Fractions are still permitted. Donation is still prohibited. Let's not forget this. So the ethical tension remains, but it's no longer weaponized. Yeah. So what happens to genuine love? What happens to genuine spirituality? Okay. I want to make this statement. So this moves the problem from coercive compliance to genuine moral discernment. So this moves the problem from coercive compliance to genuine moral discernment. So if JW, now as a whole, and look, we're not saying all of JW, but the weeds element. Remember, I talk about the wheat and the weeds. So if JW openly acknowledged the contradiction, the weed element, now acknowledged, says, right, we can now reach the heart of the question. Let's assume that the organization says plainly and honestly something like this. Statement, blood fractions are derived from whole blood donated by others. Jehovah's Witnesses do not donate blood. Therefore, our members, our associates, benefit from a medical system sustained by non-witness donors. This is a moral tension we acknowledge. What this immediately accomplishes is moral honesty. The member, the associate, is no longer gaslit. Sister Susie Sue, in our story, her intuition is validated. Right? She's no longer forced to suppress ethical awareness. Think about elder brother Joey Joe. Right? We've now got shared responsibility. The burden no longer rests on the individual alone. The organization owns the paradox. You now have a community working together properly because it's got shared responsibility. That burden no longer just crushing this person, resting on this person. The person now is unburdened. Right? There's still responsibility, but the organization owns the paradox. And so conscience becomes supported. Okay? This is the love aspect that should be there, not isolated. And so you've got a reduction of absolutism. When institutions admit imperfection, not forced into it, but going, should be our highest ethic. Not a blanket statement, not some kind of spin city statement to curry favor. I mean, really does it. Admits the imperfection. Not a blanket statement, not pretty words to tickle the ears. Individuals stop compensating with rigidity. And so this alone would likely prevent the total refusal outcome that we see in this description in Sister Susie Sue's case. And so her decision process changes with just that mere acknowledgement. Her inner dialogue shifts from, oh, if I accept fractions, I'm complicit to the wrongdoing, to I live in an imperfect system. I must act compassionately and proportionally within it. And on this basis, I can decide. I don't know what her decision would be. It might be the same. It might differ. But this is the difference between deontological purity ethics, that's rules above outcomes, and relational ethics, life, responsibility, proportionality. And very importantly, she can still dislike the system. She can still hope for a better one. And so she isn't forced to sacrifice her child to maintain coherence. Maybe that does happen. Maybe that's the choice. And society has got to just say, well, that is the right of the religion. But the point is, she isn't forced to sacrifice her child to maintain coherence. Neither is she forced in another direction. Look, yeah. This is not a small change. It's decisive. So what happens to responsibility and liability? So if the organization now openly acknowledges the contradiction, courts are less likely to treat refusals as idiosyncratic. What do I want to say? Idiosyncratic extremism or fanaticism. So elders cannot later deny the ethical pressure existed. The organization becomes a moral participant, not a silent beneficiary. And this is what gets people's backs up. Ironically, this reduces catastrophic outcomes. It also reduces legal exposure. Do you hear the solutions here? This is supposed to be a solution-oriented presentation. I'm hoping that with this scenario, we're already seeing a reduction in the legal exposure because transparency diffuses the blame. Silence concentrates liability on the weakest person. In this case, with Susie Sue, the family, the parent in crisis. So what still would not happen, even in this better world? Well, even with full honesty, JW would still prohibit donation. That's where we are. Can't donate blood. Fractions would still depend on outsiders. Okay, it hasn't changed. The Ishtar logical hope would still defer resolution. So the system would be temporarily dependent on non-adherence. But the difference is this. Dependence would be acknowledged rather than denied. And that changes everything psychologically. So the key insight, this is the crux of the matter. Okay? The scenario that the most dangerous element is not the blood doctrine itself, but it's the combination of moral contradiction, denial, coercive enforcement. And so remove and acknowledge, and the system becomes survivable. Keep all three, and sincere people break in pieces. Back to our one sentence to capture the altered dynamics. Here's the attempt. When judicial enforcement is removed and moral contradictions are acknowledged, conscience becomes a space for discernment rather than a crucible that forces tragic absolutism. So I hope that sentence explains the what if, why it matters. So I think of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church went into a lot of this. They went into a lot of this with the vaccines, the birth control, the greater good aspect. We didn't hear about that. JW community didn't hear about it. You had to really search for that. So yeah, it's interesting to look into the Catholic moral theology. What actually happened? How did the Pope get involved with the cardinals? What actually happened, and what was the double effect? And then to look at all of this and say, well, how do we map this with legal standards for informed religious consent, or how do we explore how organizations use conscience to shift risk downward? Folks, I want to say let's still be careful. I try to be careful. I don't get it perfect. I'm doing my best, all right? And look, I'm grateful. I'm grateful to be able to talk in this way. I'm grateful for the encouragement that I've got from survivor communities, from persons who've made stands and who just said, well, we can't carry on with the spiritual abuse. I'm very grateful. Absolutely mean that. So, yeah, let's continue to be careful. Let's be humane. Let's see how precise we can be in thinking this through. Because I'll tell you what the difference is now. The difference is now with these videos and survivor community is that care from being authentic, and it's not perfect, okay? It's not perfect, but the care is exactly what systems like what has happened in the weeds among Jehovah's Witnesses tend not to make room for. Now, this has been a long presentation. I thank you if you've been able to take this in increments or been able to absorb it. This is more to have this on record and to just put it into the system. Let AI read it. Let it be cataloged somehow. Even if it's just only Matt processing these things as they come up. I don't say I've got all the answers. This is a discussion to get it out there. I value the comments greatly. I value the community, the persons coming in at the city gates to either say, oh, we hate this discussion, we can't stand it, or to say, oh, we love it, or others to come up with just brilliant simplicity or clear-minded things. What I'm trying to say is I want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for being with me. And I do wish all blessings. I wish those that are in a captive situation like what I've discussed, I wish them blessings. I wish a better situation. I wish those that who have just said look for health, I'm walking away. I wish you blessings as well. Those who beliefs are now light years ahead, I wish you blessings. I am very thankful again for you being here. I cannot overemphasize this. I'm grateful to my family. I'm grateful to my friends. I'm grateful for those interested, those who are in enforcement, those who are involved in psychology, those who are interested in human spiritual development, those who are here, perhaps in a Bethel, who have been assigned to look at these videos. I thank you all. So let me sign off. It's Matthew Mile Gray, and wishing you well again, just emphasizing that you are the reason I am here. Thank you.